VoyMonk Video Voiceover. And this month, I've talked a bit about the 80s, and I will talk probably a lot more about the 80s and the 90s, because these are the decades that were the most impactful and influential to me in terms of my growing up and the way that I view and see the world. And so specifically, I wanted to do this video voiceover about why the 80s was so special to me and why I love the 80s and growing up in the 80s. And even though I grew up poor, Section 8 housing, on welfare, a mom that's a single mother with 2 kids who had developmental issues, and I have had developmental issues as well. We lived in a world that was, we didn't have a whole lot of anything, and we made do by what was available and what we had. And so, like I said, you can say those types of things with shame, or you can say those types of things as events in life that just really were circumstances, whether they were made or you were made in. It didn't matter. But I did love the 80s. And obviously I was younger then, so again, there's that perspective as far as anything else. But the thing that I loved about the 80s and looking back, aside from just my bias, and I think from a bit of an objective lens, is that I think the overall sense that I had then versus now, being someone that's an introvert and someone who's always had anxiety in terms of since birth and depression, I would say that although, and I wouldn't necessarily look at it as a this or that, better or worse type of situation. I'm just talking about what I loved about it and maybe what made it a little bit different, which is I lived in a time that basically there were no cell phones. Now, obviously, my mom lived in a time that there was almost no phones at all, but there weren't any cell phones. So if you had to talk to somebody, you had better make sure that whatever it is that you needed to say, you meant to say, you had said it when you needed to, how you had to. Otherwise, you were going to have to wait until you were in a place around a phone or popping in a quarter into a payphone. And so I think because of that, it oftentimes meant that I think the view of time as a currency and how precious it was, and the time that you spent doing something or with someone, just looking back and even then seemed a little bit more special. I mean, I'm not saying that we didn't waste time. I'm not saying that we didn't squander opportunities in terms of, there's people that will tell you that the last conversations that they had with people that were very important to them were conversations maybe they would have had a different way, or they would have spent more time saying how much they cared or loved that person. And I would say that no matter where you are, I don't think whether it's now or then, it may ever seem like there's enough time to do those types of things. Or sometimes you may wish that you had spent more time in times that you needed to. But I think in the 80s, the thing that was special is that there was a little bit more of that emphasis on, well, you better say it now, because the next time you may have an opportunity might be a little bit later or further away. And I think not having text or email or being able to look things up and have as much access to not only content, entertainment, or things to distract you, that was also another thing that I thought was pretty special. In contrast with my mom, like I said, she had maybe one, not even all 3 of the channels. And in my time, you had the 3-4 channels and UHF. And if you were really, really one of the lucky ones, you had cable. But, cable wasn't everything. And there was still a sense that even with maybe 40 or 50, well, I wouldn't say 40, maybe about 40 channels, they kind of claimed it was 50 channels, but that was usually like the premium channels like HBO, Showtime, Cinemax, and that kind of thing. And usually kind of like this, platform streaming services, you usually had one or the other. Some people probably had big bucks that they could get all the premium channels. But even for the time, that would cost you, I think, probably roughly close to $100, which by now standards, I think some people say, well, that's really cheap. But there was no internet. And I think most of the premium channels that we had, they were basically ran by studios. And the kind of content that it they were movies that had been out of the theaters and, of course, out of the video box rental stores for probably about 3 to 6 months. And then they would come piecemeal to the subscription premium services on cable like HBO, Showtime, and that kind of thing. But it was very piecemeal. I mean, if you got like Ghostbusters, you better had planned on seeing Ghostbusters a few times in the month because one of the common criticisms of like HBO and Showtime is that for the shows that you got in the premium lineup as far as movies, they were the same movies every single day for the most part, just kind of run on a little bit of a conveyor belt, like a trail or whatever. And it's like, so like I said, even with that, there was definitely a ceiling or an end to whatever you could ever watch or see. So you're pretty much stuck with, if you weren't an introvert like myself, you'd have to go outside. You'd have to make friends. You'd have to get involved with things like community and clubs and talk to your neighbor and, get involved with what's going on in your neighborhood. And I think that was oftentimes a sense that was really underappreciated at the time, but in contrast to now, which I can honestly say the place that I live, I don't know the first name of a single neighbor, right? I've never even met the people that live closer to me than I would say just about anyone that I actually know or family. And so, and I don't think that I'm alone in that. I think there's lots of people that are in the same similar situation. And then with the 80s, I do get the sense that even though there wasn't the internet and phones everywhere, there was definitely a sense of placement and community that I don't think is quite exactly the same as it is today. It wasn't always necessarily better or worse. I mean, I think sometimes back, people often reminisce about small towns, right? Like it's a small town, right? Everybody knows your name and safety and all that. Well, safety, of course, yeah, sure, to some degree, but not always. I mean, sometimes if you have families, you'll know some of the most dangerous and sometimes the most unstable people that in your life can be family. So, if you're an Xer over the 40s and you hear the term fam getting thrown around, that might make you a little gun shy sometimes, a little bit, because I'm not saying families are always good or always bad, but usually families come with commitment. And it's, if you have family, it isn't someone that you selected. It's usually someone that, is related and connected to you by blood or birth, And so it's, like I said, family can be good. Family can be just an obligation in some cases. And like I said, that sense of community, like I said, if I would say small towns or whatever. I mean, small towns were small, but sometimes small minds. Sometimes communities where, if you get a reputation through gossip, whether it's earned or not, it was oftentimes something that you were stuck with, no matter what. And I can honestly say that in many cases, people that lived in small towns, many of the times, if they went ahead and had children, the thing that they would often talk most about is getting out of that small town and getting away, because it's, like I said, no cell phones, no outside access besides what you could get in the car and drive to, or get on a bike or something like that. So your community was, I wouldn't say necessarily your family, but it was as close to I guess your tribal family as one could really get. And some people long for that. That's great. But again, but I'm not sure necessarily everyone always knows what that means. I mean, making an investment in other people is a strange, dangerous, curious, and sometimes not so rewarding venture. I mean, many times it can be, but it's not like the TV shows. I mean, everybody, I think, can kind of appreciate that. It wasn't the Brady Bunch. It wasn't, the, it wasn't Family Matters. It wasn't the Cosby Show. I mean, real life, real people, real situations. Some of the most dangerous situations that cops will ever face will be domestic situations. So, like I said, the closer you are, the more in touch you are with people, even if it's a small town, the better your chances of likely having a disagreement, coming into conflict, getting to know each other too much. I think one of the experiences I had is that, knowing someone for a long time, and then because they're friends, decide, hey, what would be great? Let's move in with one another. Let's be roommates. And if you've ever had that kind of experience, I think I think it's pretty well known, maybe, that sometimes that doesn't really work out, because while, someone might be a great friend or close, sometimes the closer you are, the longer you know someone, the easier it is to get on each other's nerves. So, like I said, it wasn't all good. It wasn't all bad. Like I said, but the 80's were definitely different as far as food and going out, to going to the movie theater and that kind of thing. I mean, you didn't have movies readily available the way they are now. If you wanted to see a movie and you're an introvert like me, you had to decide whether or not you were going to go out and sit in groups and groves full of people just to watch Batman with Michael Keaton, by the way. Or you wanted to wait till the matinee, which was before the 7 o'clock showing, and you get a couple bucks off to see the same film, or wait a few days, a couple weeks, and you can go to the $2 theater during a lazy Monday afternoon if you have a day off work, and go see it for really cheap. So, like I said, it was a great it was a great experience, and I loved the 80's because, good, bad, or whatever. I mean, it was different, and like I said, the food, the experiences, as far as sense of community, the sense that, along with the community, and I'm not talking about just small towns, but I'm talking about cities, and that there were, like in New York, there were boroughs, right? Like little small pockets inside cities, which were kind of like small towns inside of a big town. And so neighborhoods, right? If you weren't representing your city, you were representing your neighborhood, or like I said, with New York, maybe a borough or whatever. So, like I said, those were some of the things that were different, and the things that I loved. I loved the food. I loved the fact that, while things were limited, there was also a sense of adventure, because, there were things that you sometimes really just didn't know. And because, life didn't come at you quite as quickly as it does now in terms of information and everything else, you oftentimes had a little bit of more time to take. And usually nobody ever took that time because everybody wanted to be in a rush. I mean, that's how we got to where we're at today because, people wanted things bigger, smaller, bigger, stronger, faster, longer, harder, whatever. You get what I'm saying. I mean, people were interested in the world that we now have today. But in contrast, it's like now it seems like, life comes at us almost too fast. People who are younger almost look older than the way they looked back then, or, vice versa. I mean, I'm not talking about anything good or bad. I'm just explaining the differences. And the things that I loved were the memories and the people that I loved and the people that, I had gone through this journey in life with. And I think that more than just the fact that it was the 80s is why I loved the 80s and why the 80s was so special to me, because it wasn't just, I mean, people kind of equate the music and the culture and all that kind of stuff, but believe it or not, a lot of that wasn't really appreciated for the time that it was in. And I think oftentimes, just like now, probably give it another 20, 30, 40 years, you get the same thing that'll happen. Like I said, I remember being in the 80s and hearing about the 60s and 70s. And oftentimes it was revered the exact same way, with the criticisms about our generation and the ones that came before us and so on and so forth. And it was the same kind of critiques in many ways as well. And so the point is that not a criticism, not anything else like that, just this. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And the only way to, change the past is to learn from it. But, sometimes that's easier said than obviously done. And to want to make a change, to want to do something in the first place, I think it actually requires a lot of understanding how and why you're at a place that you don't want to be, that, or maybe even if you are at a place that you don't want to be, that you want to change it for something else. And specifically what? I think in a world where now we're close to 9 billion, and in the 80s it was close to maybe 5 or 6 or a bit less. The thing is that a world, I think we moved forward, and like I said, for good or bad, I remember the 80s for what it was as far as to me. Like I said, it wasn't the greatest because of any singular thing that I think kind of gets pointed at. It was special to me because I lived it, and I understood, and I knew what Prince was singing about when he talked about "Let's Go Crazy," right? I understood what Thriller was really about in terms of some people thinking, what it might have been about, as opposed to the way society and the way everyone lived, about, throwing yourself against the social norms a bit. The 80s was considered the me generation. I remember that. That was actually on a magazine, and it kind of stuck because the 60s and 70s was very much about the we and the culture and all that. And the 80s, it pretty much was defined as the me. And that's as much as I say about how much it was more of a community, and people didn't necessarily talk in the way that they do now, and things were a bit slower. Yeah, but there were still some other things. So, like I said, it was a great time. Like I said, the television shows were, like I said, they were an experience because of not only just great writing, great development, and great plots. Not all of them. Keep in mind, there's plenty of material for Mystery Science Theater 3000. But it was also because so much of it was a shared experience. And if you lived in that time, then I think you might know a little bit of what I'm saying in terms of that. But yeah, it was special to me because of that. Now, it's one of my favorites, but between the 80s and 90s, it's a real it's really a competition for me because, like I said, I loved both, but I grew up in my early, like, weaned into my teens, and then my teens were basically experienced through the 90s, and so the 90s has a special place in my heart because of that, and I'll definitely, I don't know, maybe go into that a little bit about the 90s in terms of the contrast. It's when the cell phones started to come around and the internet became a thing, and you know what that did, but 80s didn't have any of that. It was definitely the years of some of the greatest music that was considered too robotic, too technical, too synthesizers and synthetic, which I loved. But like I said, the food, the culture, the life, that's what I love the most about the 80s. So let's see, it's about 21 minutes. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about on this video voiceover. Why the 80s were so special to me and why I love the 80s. And so until my next video voiceover, take over. Take care.